The Imperium of Man has thousands of warships, but none of them hit like a Space Marine battle barge. These aren't escort frigates or patrol vessels. These are continent-killing void platforms, and we're breaking down every single variant from the baseline model all the way up to moon-sized mobile fortresses, starting with the ship that every other entry on this list was built to improve upon. Battle Barge Mark I. Here's the thing about the Mark I. It is the least impressive ship on this entire list, and it can still erase a continent from orbit before breakfast. The Mark I is the baseline Space Marine capital ship, somewhere between 8 and 12 kilometers long, armed with bombardment cannons, torpedo tubes, and macro cannon batteries built specifically for planetary assault. By any metric outside of this video, that is an objectively terrifying amount of firepower in one hull. But within the Adeptus Astartes fleet hierarchy, the Mark I is basically the starter weapon. Younger chapters field them, reserve fleets run them, and it works, but nobody is impressed by it. The designation itself is quietly contested, with certain texts treating pre-upgrade battle barges generically rather than labeling them as a distinct generation. Retroactive classification across 10,000 years of Imperial history is, to put it charitably, a recurring problem. The Mark II fixed most of what the Mark I got wrong. Most of it. Battle Barge Mark II. The Mark II is what a battle barge actually is, in the same way a Labrador is what a dog actually is. Everything else is a variation. This is the baseline. At 8 to 12 kilometers long, the Mark II is the most common Astartes capital ship in existence. More of these exist than any other Space Marine vessel. If you randomly pointed at a chapter fleet somewhere in the Imperium, statistically, this is what you'd be pointing at. It is the workhorse, the template, the thing every other ship in this video gets measured against. Here's the thing though, the word baseline is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because the baseline includes heavy lance batteries, standard lance batteries, and plasma projector batteries running across the hull. That's before you get to the Thunderhawk squadrons sitting in dedicated launch bays, which means this ship doesn't just participate in invasions, it launches them independently, entirely on its own, from orbit. And running all of that requires a crew of tens of thousands of people. Every single one of them exists to put Space Marines on a planet as violently as possible. Most Imperial cities don't have that many people. This ship's staffing requirements exceed the population of entire habitation clusters, and this is the normal one. If the Mark II sounds absurdly overpowered for a baseline vessel, wait until you see what the Gloriana class was built to do. Gloriana class battleship. A battle barge is one of the most powerful warships humanity has ever produced, and compared to a Gloriana class, it's basically a rowboat. A standard battle barge runs somewhere between 8 and 12 kilometers in length, which sounds enormous until you learn that a Gloriana class pushes somewhere between 20 and 28 kilometers. That isn't a warship. That's a moving city with guns the size of cathedrals. The firepower scales accordingly, with Nova cannon batteries, lance arrays, and macro weapon systems built at a scale that simply has no equivalent in anything the Imperium fields today. The crew complement exceeded 50,000 personnel. Its shield generators, despite being thousands of years old, predate and in some respects surpass modern Imperial standards, which is an uncomfortable sentence to sit with when you think about it too long. Only 20 were ever confirmed built, all during the Great Crusade, serving as personal flagships for the Space Marine legions at the height of human expansion. The Ultramarines Macraga's honor is probably the most famous surviving example, though which legions actually received one and whether any were permanently destroyed during the Horus Heresy is a debate the lore community still hasn't fully resolved. Here's where it gets genuinely melancholy. The Imperium of M41 cannot build a new one, not because they lack the resources or the will. They lack the knowledge. The engineering understanding required to construct a Gloriana-class vessel simply no longer exists. Every surviving ship isn't just a warship at that point. It's a relic, an artifact from a version of humanity that was smarter, more capable, and more ambitious than anything that came after. And that version lost a civil war and took most of its secrets with it. If you find that tragic, the Abyss class has an entirely different kind of story, and it's somehow darker. A B E E E C HC class battleship. Something was eating the ships. That's the only reasonable explanation for why the Imperium, an organization that already builds warships the size of small cities, looked at its existing fleet and decided it needed something fundamentally different. The Abyss class exists because standard Void War vessels were running into threats they weren't built for and losing, bad enough that someone somewhere authorized an entirely new class of warship to deal with them. Here's the thing about a ship designed specifically for anti-demon and warp threat engagements. The fact that it exists at all is an admission. The Imperium, flying around in 10-kilometer battle platforms with enough firepower to crack a continent, looked at certain categories of enemy and said quietly that the standard kit wasn't cutting it. That's an uncomfortable thing to admit when you're already operating the most destructive warships in human history. The Abyss class runs somewhere between 9 and 10 kilometers in length and carries psychic shielding systems you won't find on any comparable vessel, alongside experimental weapon systems built specifically for void entity engagement. Its crew sits between 30,000 and 35,000 personnel, and it is slow, significantly slower than other ships in its weight class, which is a design choice that tells you everything about what it's supposed to fight. These threats don't run from you. You aren't trying to catch anything, you're trying to survive the encounter. Only 3 to 5 confirmed operational examples exist, which is either a production bottleneck or a monument to how often they don't come back. Here's where it gets genuinely murky though. The Abyss class appears sporadically across specialist supplements and campaign books without ever receiving comprehensive codex treatment. Some sources fold it into unnamed experimental variants entirely. Its canonical record is appropriately for a ship built to fight warp entities, poorly documented and half lost to shadow, which honestly fits. The Infernus class has a different problem. Less mysterious, more catastrophic. Infernus class battleship. If the Abyss class is a fortress that happens to move, the Infernus class is a missile that happens to have people inside it. Same rough size bracket, 9 to 9.5 kilometers, but that is where the similarities end. The Infernus isn't built to endure. It's built to arrive fast, hit hard, and make planetary surfaces regret existing. Engine output is prioritized over armor in ways that would give a standard naval architect a minor breakdown, and the weapons are optimized specifically for atmospheric bombardment rather than extended ship-to-ship combat. Void War is basically an afterthought here. The Infernus exists to crack open a planet, not win a prolonged slugfest in deep space. And here's the thing, that philosophy extends straight to the crew numbers. 25 to 28,000 personnel, which is lean for a capital ship operating at this scale. Less support, less redundancy, faster operations. The Infernus isn't designed for sustained presence. It's designed for delivery, which makes the chapter association angle genuinely interesting. Because the Infernus is closely linked to aggressive, crusade-minded factions, the Black Templars being the obvious example. And that's not a coincidence. The ships a chapter prefers tell you exactly how that chapter thinks war should work. Speed over endurance, offense over defense, get in fast and break something. The Infernus is basically a personality test disguised as a battleship. There are only an estimated 12 to 15 examples in active service, and there is still genuine debate about whether the Infernus is even a formally distinct class at all, or just a collective name for battle barges that have been so heavily modified for assault roles that calling them anything else felt dishonest. But speaking of ancient designs that have quietly outlasted everyone's expectations, the Warspite class is next, and its story is less about aggression and more about stubbornly refusing to die. Strike Cruiser. There's a version of obsolescence that looks like decay, and then there's the Strike Cruiser, which looks like a cathedral that somehow learned to fire Nova cannons. These ships are the backbone of Astartes fleet operation in a way that no other vessel class quite manages. Not because they're the biggest or the most heavily armed, absurd, but because they do everything. Troop transport, orbital bombardment, void combat, rapid deployment. One hull, all of it. Here's the thing though, that versatility comes with a cost that doesn't show up in a weapons manifest. The Strike Cruiser is not a line warship. It's faster and more maneuverable than a battleship, built for insertion and extraction rather than slugging it out in prolonged fleet engagements. It accepts that trade without apology, because what it gets in return is a flexibility that purpose-built warships genuinely cannot match. These ships don't just fight, they enable everything else, but the scale is where it gets quietly staggering. A standard strike cruiser carries a full company of Space Marines alongside their armored vehicles, drop pods, and support and equipment. Roughly 100 Astartes plus all the mortal crew required to actually run the ship. That crew runs somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 people, keeping one vessel operational. For a fighting force that numbers maybe 1,000 warriors per chapter at full strength, the logistical footprint is enormous. You're not just deploying soldiers, you're moving a small city to the fight. Most chapters operate several strike cruisers as their primary fleet assets, often named for chapter heroes or pivotal battles, carrying centuries of battle honors on hulls that have outlived the people who christened them multiple times over. The tactical value is real, but that's almost beside the point. These are vessels that function as chapter houses between the stars. The Battle Barge carries a different kind of weight entirely, and it starts with the question of what a chapter actually needs when subtlety is no longer an option. Basileus class. The Basileus class is one of the strangest ships in the Astartes fleet, and not because it's particularly impressive in a fight. It's strange range because it was specifically designed to be bad at fighting. That's not an insult, that's the whole point. Sitting at 8.2 to 8.8 kilometers, the Basilius class is built from the keel up as a mobile chapter headquarters. Enhanced command suites, redundant command structures layered over each other, advanced void shield projectors, and armament that's been deliberately optimized for defense rather than offense. The ship is not there to kill things. The ship is there to keep the people inside it alive while other ships kill things. Here's the thing, that's actually a statement about how the Imperium understands leadership. The brain of the chapter gets more armor than the fist. The chapter master and his staff are irreplaceable in a way that a lance battery simply isn't. So you wrap them in the toughest shell you can build and you accept the trade-off. It's cold logic dressed up as a warship, but here's where it gets complicated. Fewer than 6 to 8 of these things are estimated to exist, total, across the entire Imperium. That production number is so low it suggests one of two things. Either the compromise between flagship capability and combat effectiveness failed to satisfy everyone involved, or someone deliberately kept the numbers this low. Neither explanation is particularly reassuring, and the Imperium's record keeping is not exactly going to clear this up for you. There's also a genuine community debate about whether the Basilius class is actually a distinct class at all, or just a standard battle barge that got retrofitted with command infrastructure and received a new name on paperwork that nobody audits. The Imperium has approximately 10,000 years of bureaucratic chaos backing that possibility up. The Legatus class shares some of that same flagship DNA, but with a very different approach to the same problem. Legatus class. Here's the thing about the Imperium of Man. It doesn't do efficiency. It does scale. It does brutality. It does throw in 50,000 lives at a problem until the problem stops existing. So when a ship shows up smaller than the competition and somehow matches it on firepower, that's practically a miracle. The Legatus class runs between 7.8 and 8.4 kilometers, crewed by 20,000 to 24,000, and designed specifically as a fleet command vessel, built around an enhanced command suite that coordinates chapter-level naval operations without needing a ship twice its size to do it. On paper, it sounds like a compromise. Turns out, no. The weaponry matches or slightly exceeds a standard battle barge despite the shorter hull. Someone sat down, optimized the internal layout, and got more out of less. In a civilization that regularly loses the instructions for its own technology, that's genuinely remarkable. The Legatus is one of those moments where the Imperium briefly remembered how engineering works. Compare it to the Basilius class and you've got two ships solving the same problem from completely different directions. The Basilius shrinks to protect its command staff, pulling its punches on offense in exchange for survivability. The Legatus shrinks to concentrate its weapons more effectively, treating the internal layout as a strategic asset. Same design challenge. Two completely different answers. Around 12 to 18 examples exist across multiple chapters, and its streamlined command structure reportedly produces higher crew efficiency than larger flagships. Less ship, better results. The one headache is a lore classification debate that refuses to die. Whether the Legatus represents a formally distinct design or just a compact battle barge variant with insufficient differences to warrant its own category is still contested, which means it can be legal in one competitive community and a footnote in the next room over. The Dominus class has zero of these problems, mostly because nobody debates whether something that size deserves its own category. Dominus class. The Dominus class is where Space Marine ship design stops being engineering and starts being philosophy. At 10 to 11 kilometers long, crewed by 35,000 to 40,000 plus personnel, this is the ceiling, the absolute maximum practical scale for a vessel the Adeptus Astartes can plausibly operate before their logistics stop making sense entirely. And here's the thing about that crew number. A standard Space Marine chapter fields 1,000 warriors. That's it. That's the entire fighting force. So what you have with a Dominus class is 40,000 people on a ship built to carry 1,000 soldiers into battle. That is not a warship. That is a small city that occasionally drops Space Marines on a planet. Their armament backs up the scale at least. Over 20 broadside lance batteries, specialized macro weapon systems, void shield arrays more sophisticated than anything else the Astartes operate at this size. On paper, it is one of the most formidable warships in the entire fleet. In practice, fewer than 5 confirmed examples are known to exist across the entire Imperium, which tells you something about how sustainable this design actually is in the long run, because that's the honest question the Dominus class raises. Does any chapter actually need this? Most chapters never face threats that require a mobile command platform at this scale. The enhanced command facilities are exceptional. The firepower is exceptional. The crew requirement is borderline institutional. Sustaining a Dominus class demands support infrastructure that sits well beyond what standard chapter logistics can comfortably absorb without dedicated resources beyond normal capacity. It is impressive. It is also faintly absurd. A monument to the idea that if something is worth doing, it is worth doing at a scale that creates entirely new problems. The Ryza class takes a different approach to that problem entirely. Ryza class. The Ryza class is 9 to 9.5 kilometers long, and it is fast. Let that settle for a second because your brain is going to try to reject it. At 9 kilometers, speed is not supposed to be a selling point. Speed is what frigates talk about. Speed is for the small ships that zip around the edges of a fleet action, while the real vessels stand still and shoot each other into rubble. But the Ryza class runs a higher sustained void speed than any comparable battleship in the Astartes fleet inventory, and it does it deliberately because that was the entire design brief. Here's how that works. The propulsion array on a Ryza class takes up real estate. Armament gets trimmed to make room for engines that have no business being on something this large. It is a conscious trade, and the Mechanicus engineers who drew up the specs knew exactly what they were giving away to get it. The crew sits at 23,000 to 27,000 personnel, operating a platform built specifically for rapid response and expedition command. Chapters whose doctrine says reach the enemy first and dictate the engagement treat the Ryza class as the obvious flagship choice. You don't wait for the war to come to you. You go get it. Here's where the community splits hard. Competitive players will tell you that speed advantages at Void War scales are basically theoretical because engagements unfold across distances so enormous that arriving marginally faster makes zero practical difference to the shooting. Narrative players push back and say that misses the point entirely because rapid redeployment between sectors, getting a capital ship to a crisis before the crisis becomes a catastrophe, is a strategic advantage that no amount of additional Lance batteries can replicate. Neither side is wrong. The Imperium hasn't resolved this argument either, which is honestly the most imperial outcome possible. The Venerable Battle Barge takes that philosophical debate and buries it under about 3,000 years of history. Venerable Battle Barge. There is no technical specification for a Venerable Battle Barge. No standard loadout, no unified hull configuration, no blueprint you could pull from a Mechanicus archive and say, yes, this is what one looks like. The designation isn't an engineering classification. It's closer to a title. An acknowledgement, a ship that has been in continuous service for over 3,000 years earns the word venerable the same way a warrior earns a name, through surviving things that should have killed it. And here's what 3,000 years does to a ship. It makes it unique. Every Venerable Battle Barge started as something recognizable, a standard hull, a known configuration, a vessel with documented specifications. Then the centuries happened. A gun battery destroyed and replaced with whatever was available on the nearest station, a hull section patched with mismatched components, ritual modifications added by tech marines who treated the work as prayer rather than engineering. After 3 millennia of piecemeal repair, the original design is less a maintained standard and more a philosophical concept. No two are alike. Every single one is its own artifact. Crew manifests of 18,000 to 25,000 operate these ships, and most Venerable Battle Barges spend the majority of their time in reserve or ceremonial roles. Newer vessels are faster, more reliable, better understood by the crews maintaining them. The Venerable survives not because it is the best option, but because losing it is not an option. That distinction matters. When a chapter loses a battle barge to enemy fire, it requisitions another. When a chapter loses its Venerable, it grieves properly, because that's exactly what a Venerable Battle Barge is. 3,000 years of memory given a hull and engines and the stubbornness to keep moving through the void. No replacement vessel, regardless of capability, addresses that wound. But if the Venerable Battle Barge represents a chapter's memory, the Fortress Monastery is its soul made solid. And what that means in practical terms is almost incomprehensible. Fortress Monastery. Everything before this point has been a warship. A very large, very dangerous warship, but a warship. Something you build, crew, deploy, and if you lose it, you grieve, requisition a replacement, and move on. Fortress monasteries are not that. They are not vessels that house a chapter. They are the chapter given a hull. We are talking about structures ranging from 15 to 20 plus kilometers in combined dimensions. Crew complements exceeding 100,000 when you count every warrior, serf, artificer, and support staff living inside them. Weapon systems that make standard battleships look like they showed up to the fight with a kitchen knife. These things can sustain independent operations for 50 or more years without any resupply contact whatsoever. They are not warships. They are mobile nations that happen to be armed. The two examples you need to understand are the Rock and the Phalanx. The Rock is the Dark Angel's headquarters, around 15 kilometers of primary structure and ancient in a way that stops being a number and starts being a feeling. Because the Rock was not built, it is what remains of Caliban, the Dark Angel's homeworld, after it was torn apart by a catastrophic explosion at the end of the Horus Heresy. The Dark Angels have been carrying the shattered remnants of their destroyed planet through space for 10,000 years. That is not a ship. That is a wound that never healed, hollowed out and fitted with guns. Every secret buried in its deepest chambers is a secret from a history the chapter has never stopped running from. The Phalanx belongs to the Imperial Fist, and its story is different but equally impossible to look at directly. It is a Horus Heresy-era Legion flagship that has never stopped moving in 10,000 years, not once. Continuous operations since before the Imperium as we know it existed. The Imperial Fists are a chapter defined entirely by siege and endurance, and their home is a ship that has simply never stopped. Somehow that is exactly right. This is why the loss of a fortress monastery is treated as something different from a military setback. Lose a battle barge and you lose a ship. Lose a fortress monastery and you lose the accumulated culture, the genetic heritage, the institutional memory, and the identity of an entire chapter simultaneously. Everything, all at once. Which is why a chapter will spend every ship it owns and every life it can justify spending before it allows one to fall. There is no recovering from that loss. There is only extinction by another name. Every vessel in this video was impressive. Some were ancient, some were terrifying, some were both. But a fortress monastery is the only one where you realize it was never really a ship at all. It was always something else, a home, a history, a people, just one that can fire back. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.